Russia collapsing might sound like the best news you've heard all year. After decades of invasions, poisonings, election interference, and one catastrophic war of choice, a lot of people would pop the champagne. Finally, the bully gets what's coming. But here's the problem with that fantasy. Because when Russia actually collapses, not weakens, not stumbles, but collapses, the celebration will last about 30 seconds. And then, something far worse begins. We're talking about a country spanning 11 time zones, the largest landmass on Earth, an economy built on energy blackmail, dozens of ethnic republics that have been sitting on grievances for decades, private armies with nothing left to lose, regional warlords who've been waiting for exactly this moment, and sitting underneath all of it, the world's largest nuclear arsenal. Nearly 5,500 warheads, more than the United States, more than every other nuclear power on the planet combined. History shows what happens when Russia breaks. It doesn't fade away gracefully. It doesn't negotiate a managed transition. It explodes. Russia has already collapsed twice in the last century, in 1917 and again in 1991. Both times, the world was not ready, and both times, the fallout reshaped everything. But those collapses happened when the warlords had private armies, before the nukes were this exposed, before China was this ready. The next one is different. And today we're going to break down exactly what happens when Russia collapses, and why what follows could be the most dangerous chain reaction of the 21st century. Here's something that most people don't understand about Russia. For all its projection of power, the military parades, nuclear threats, iron grip on the media, well, the Russian state is actually not built to last. It's built to extract. The entire system operates on what political scientists call a power vertical, a top-down chain of control where the Kremlin sits at the top, regional governors sit beneath it, and everyone below is expected to deliver. Taxes, resources, recruits, loyalty. In return, Moscow sends money back down, just enough to keep things stable. That arrangement works pretty beautifully, as long as Moscow has money to send. Russia's 89 federal subjects are not equal partners in a federation. They're extraction zones. Moscow alone absorbs over 21% of all fixed capital investment in the entire country. The vast interior, Siberia, the Far East, North Caucasus, they get the scraps. This creates a country with a shining capital and a hollowed-out body. And that body has been getting hollower every year. Corruption is the operating system that holds all of it together. Oligarchs and regional elites are permitted to steal as long as they remain loyal and fulfill the Kremlin's directives. Military budgets get siphoned. Infrastructure projects become personal enrichment schemes. Everyone in the system has a reason to play along. Until they don't. Because corruption doesn't just hold the system together. Over time, it destroys it. The military that went into Ukraine was supposed to be modernized, well-supplied, and dominant. What Russia actually deployed was a force riddled with the consequences of decades of institutional theft, outdated equipment, stolen logistics budgets, commanders who spent years filing false readiness reports. The state built its power on systematic looting, and now that bill is coming due. Because the war in Ukraine hasn't just exposed those cracks, it's widened them into fault lines. What Putin launched in February of 2022 was supposed to be over in 3 days. It wasn't. Instead, what he started was a slow-motion unraveling, a war of attrition that's consuming the Russian state from the inside out. The economics tell the story. To keep soldiers signing up, the Kremlin introduced what analysts now call deathonomics, massive signing bonuses for new recruits, and enormous death payments to the families of soldiers that are killed in action. In impoverished regions, these payouts become the primary driver of the local economy. Families are cashing in on their dead, and for a while, it did work. Bodies kept flowing to the front, but it's not sustainable. None of it is. Russia's federal budget deficit in 2025 reached 5.64 trillion rubles, the largest since at least 1996. 5 times higher than what the government originally planned for the year. 5 times. The deficit projections were revised upward not once, not twice, but 3 times in a single year. And it's not just the federal government bleeding. By the end of 2025, 74 out of Russia's 89 regions were running budget deficits. The combined regional shortfall hit approximately $19.2 billion, 3.6 times worse than the previous year. 74 out of 89. Federal aid to the regions has been cut for a third consecutive year. The Kremlin's telling its own territories to do more with less, while simultaneously demanding more soldiers, more war contributions, and more loyalty. Prime Minister Mishustin told lawmakers that he had spent, in his own words, many hours with Putin discussing how to close the widening gaps. The North Caucasus is already deep in the red, with economists describing it as a potential first domino in a looming regional debt crisis. Meanwhile, Russia's central bank has been forced to keep interest rates at extraordinary levels, above 21% at points in late 2024, to fight the inflation that military spending is fueling. Short-term government bond yields hit 22 to 23% in December of 24, compared to 7 to 8% before the war. The economy that once looked resilient under sanctions is now running hot, burning through reserves and stacking debt at rates that are starting to look familiar to anyone who studied the Soviet collapse in the late 1980s. And the human cost is accelerating things in ways that the budget numbers alone don't capture. Russia's demographic trajectory was already alarming before the war. The war had made it critical. Hundreds of thousands of educated professionals fled after the 2022 mobilization announcement, one of the largest brain drains in Russia's modern history. Casualties are mounting, birth rates are falling, and the mobilization itself has been brutally unequal. The men dying in the largest numbers are not from Moscow or St. Petersburg, but they are from Buryatia, Dagestan, Yakutia, the ethnic minority republics, the poor interior regions. The places already receiving the least from Moscow are now being asked to sacrifice the most. In 2024, ethnic republics saw some of the largest protests in years, driven by raw fury at manpower quotas imposed from the capital. The center is demanding sacrifice from people who have received almost nothing in return. And that's not stability, that's a lit fuse. And history tells us exactly what happens when the fuse reaches the powder. In 1917, the strains of World War I shattered the Tsarist regime. What followed was not a peaceful transition. It was a 5-year civil war that cost millions of lives. Bolsheviks, monarchists, nationalists, and foreign armies tore the empire apart. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. 15 states emerged. The aftermath triggered ethnic conflicts across the former Soviet space. In Russia itself, Chechnya's push for independence triggered 2 devastating wars. The lesson is always the same. When Russian political systems fall, they don't gently reorganize. They fracture. They fight. And shockwaves spread far beyond any border. But here's why the next collapse would be different from anything that came before. In 1917, the weapons were rifles. In 1991, the nuclear arsenal was at least nominally under a functioning central state. Today, after 4 years of war, elite fragmentation, rising private armies, and a fiscal crisis getting worse by the quarter, the architecture of control is visibly corroding. And there is no fallback. Russia's power vertical was engineered without institutional alternatives. It was built to channel everything through one man. And if that man falls, or if the system around him implodes, there's no parliament with real authority, no independent judiciary, no regional structure capable of stepping in and holding things together. The entire hierarchy of loyalties evaporates at once. But hey, before we get to what comes next, if this is the kind of geopolitical analysis that matters most to you, make sure you're subscribed. What we're about to cover is part of this story that almost nobody fully thinks through. So what does Russia actually look like when Moscow loses its grip? Not one country in chaos, but several competing entities, each with their own weapons, their own leadership, their own agenda, and they are already taking shape. The critical thing to understand is that none of these fault lines are new. They've existed for decades, suppressed by money, coercion, and the sheer force of a personalized authoritarian system. What the war has done is starve the mechanisms of suppression, the subsidies, the security guarantees, the patronage networks, while simultaneously arming and empowering the factions that have reason to break away. Let's start with the North Caucasus. Chechnya is already, in many ways, a state within a state. Ramzan Kadyrov commands a private army whose loyalty runs to Putin personally, not to the Russian state as an institution. That distinction matters enormously. The moment that Putin is gone or weakened, Kadyrov's forces have no structural obligation to Moscow, and Kadyrov has been growing bolder, declaring blood feuds against federal lawmakers, openly criticizing senior officials in Moscow's security apparatus. He operates like a warlord who's temporarily choosing to cooperate. When the subsidies stop and Chechnya is almost entirely dependent on federal transfers, Kadyrov will need new sources of revenue. History suggests what this will look like: expansion, inter-ethnic conflict, and self-enrichment at the expense of neighbors like Ingushetia and Dagestan. Then there's Tatarstan. Now, most people outside Russia have never heard of it, but they should. Tatarstan sits at the heart of Russia's industrial corridor, controlling key energy pipelines and manufacturing infrastructure that connect Moscow to the resource wealth of the Urals and Siberia. In 1990, it declared sovereignty and eventually negotiated a special autonomy treaty with Moscow. Putin spent the following 2 decades systematically dismantling those rights, but the Tatar identity never disappeared. So if Moscow weakens, Tatarstan, it doesn't need to fire a single shot to sever the Kremlin from the resources of the East. It just has to stop cooperating. And to the east, Siberia and the Far East. Now, these regions provide the majority of Russia's natural resource wealth, yet receive a fraction of the investment. They're geographically closer to Beijing, Tokyo, and Seoul than to Moscow. In a collapse scenario, regional leaders there will ask a simple question: who can actually help us? A bankrupt, disintegrating Moscow cannot, but China, they can. China is already the dominant investor in the Russian Far East, focused on energy, forestry, and metals. A state collapse wouldn't create that Chinese footprint. It would just remove the last barrier between Beijing's ambitions and their full realization. And layered across all of this is a development that fundamentally changes the calculus: the privatization of violence. Wagner's mutiny in June of 2023 proved something that cannot be unproven. A private army could seize a major Russian city and march toward Moscow with minimal resistance from the regular military. The state's monopoly on force, the most basic requirement for any functional government, was cracked in full public view. Post-Prigozhin, the Kremlin tried to absorb these forces, but the mercenary culture was integrated rather than eliminated. The financial motivation, brutal tactics, and loyalty to money rather than flags, well, all of it is now baked into the system. And Wagner isn't the only private military structure. Business magnates have been funding their own assault units. The Ural Battalion, corporate-sponsored formations with contractual loyalty to their sponsors, not to any state. Companies have been offering signing bonuses directly to employees to enlist, effectively creating factory-to-frontline pipelines. When those factories need protecting and Moscow can no longer provide security, those same units turn inward. Think about what that means in practical terms. A Russia without central authority isn't a vacuum waiting to be filled. It's a mosaic of armed interests, each defending its own patch. Oil fields controlled by the militia of whoever owns them. Pipelines guarded by contractors answerable to whoever signs the check. In a collapse, these units don't follow a government that no longer exists. They protect assets. They seize territory. They answer to whoever is paying. Russia fragments not into a few large, manageable pieces, but into dozens of competing zones, each controlled by a warlord, an oligarch, or an armed ethnic militia. And in the middle of all that chaos sits something that could turn a catastrophic regional breakdown into a global emergency. Russia has approximately 5,459 nuclear warheads, the largest nuclear arsenal on Earth, larger than the United States, larger than every other nuclear power combined. About 1,718 of those warheads are deployed right now on land-based missiles, submarines, and bombers that are spread across the country's vast territory. In a stable Russia, that arsenal is managed through layered command and control systems. There are protocols, safeguards. The theory is that nuclear weapons should always launch when properly authorized, and never without it. That theory depends entirely on the state remaining coherent. It does not hold in a civil war. Here is the precedent that nobody wants to talk about. During the 1991 coup attempt against Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet nuclear command chain broke. For 3 days, constitutional authority to authorize a nuclear launch rested not with any elected government, but solely with military leadership. 3 days where the most consequential decision in human history came down to a small group of generals that were navigating a political crisis in real time. And that was during the relatively peaceful Soviet dissolution, before the economic implosion, before soldiers went months without pay, before the state simply ceased to function in large parts of the country. Because here's what actually happened after the Soviet Union fell. Nuclear materials were stored in facilities across Kazakhstan and other newly independent states. Workers weren't being paid. Morale was gone. Weapons-grade uranium was sitting in facilities with minimal oversight, accessible, in documented cases, to whoever showed up with enough cash. The United States ran an emergency covert operation, Project Sapphire, to secretly remove 600 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium from a remote Kazakhstani facility before it could be stolen or sold. They pulled it off because Kazakhstan's government cooperated fully and quickly. But in a chaotic Russian civil war, with multiple armed factions fighting over the same territory, with no coherent central government to coordinate with, there may be no cooperative partner to call. Just rogue commanders, desperate oligarchs looking for an exit, and a global black market for the most dangerous materials on Earth. The question's no longer whether Russia will collapse. It's about what happens to 5,459 nuclear warheads when it does. And as that internal chaos builds, two powers are already moving to fill the vacuum. China has a long memory. In the 19th century, Russia extracted enormous territorial concessions from a weakening Qing dynasty. The 1858 Treaty of Aigun and the 1860 Treaty of Peking transferred the territories that China calls Outer Manchuria, present-day Amur Oblast and Primorsky Krai, to the Russian Empire. Now, this history is not ancient to Chinese nationalists. It's taught in schools. It's remembered. The 1900 massacre at 64 villages east of the river, where Russian troops killed thousands of Chinese subjects, remains a live grievance, not a footnote. China has been patient. Russia's trade has almost been entirely reoriented toward Beijing. The ruble has been effectively yuanized. Russia now functions as a raw material supplier and strategic buffer for Chinese ambitions. In the Russian Far East, Chinese companies dominate investment in energy, timber, and rare metals, exactly the sectors a resource-hungry superpower requires. A Russian collapse wouldn't create Chinese ambitions in Siberia. Those ambitions are already there. The collapse would simply remove the final obstacle. Turkey is also watching. Ankara has spent decades trying to project influence into the Caucasus and Central Asia, the broader Turkic world. Russia has historically been the primary barrier. Remove it, and Turkey doesn't just gain neighbors. It gains the potential to anchor a geopolitical bloc stretching from the Balkans to the borders of China, controlling energy corridors that a desperate Europe depends on. Turkey has already established a land connection to Azerbaijan. Its military presence in the region is expanding. It's positioning itself now while Russia is still standing. And NATO? Well, NATO would be facing its most complex challenge since its founding. Not a conventional adversary to deter, but a disintegrating nuclear-armed state with no clear government to negotiate with, no coherent military chain of command, and dozens of armed factions competing over the same strategic assets that Western governments would desperately need to secure. Every scenario modeled for this involves racing against multiple timelines at once. Political, military, humanitarian, with no guarantee of success on any of them. So here's the full picture when it comes apart. A multi-sided civil war with private armies and warlords fighting across 11 time zones, Chinese forces moving into Siberia under the cover of stabilization to secure assets they've been cultivating for years. A collapse of order across the North Caucasus, with inter-ethnic violence spreading from Chechnya to Dagestan and beyond. NATO and Western powers scramble to locate and secure nuclear sites before they fall to whoever is winning on the ground that week. Russian oil, gas, and fertilizer suddenly removed from global markets, triggering an energy shock in Europe and food price spikes that push vulnerable countries into famine, and tens of millions of refugees streaming westward and southward, overwhelming every neighboring state and institution in their path. 6 simultaneous crises, and none of them are containable. All of them are feeding each other. The international order was built on a single quiet assumption that the major powers, however hostile, however aggressive, would continue to exist as coherent states. That Russia would always be there, threatening, destabilizing, but there, calculable, containable. That assumption is what allows diplomacy to function. It's what makes deterrence work. It's the invisible foundation beneath every alliance, every arms control agreement, every emergency hotline between capitals. So if Russia shatters, that assumption dies with it. And what replaces it is something no war game, no diplomatic framework, and no international institution has actually prepared for. Something terrible happens when Russia collapses. And the world, right now, is not ready for it. So here's what we want to know. Do you think the Russian system can hold itself together under this kind of pressure? Or is what we're watching right now, the budget crisis, the regional fractures, the dying demographics, already the slow motion beginning of something that can't be stopped? Let us know in the comments, and if this is the kind of analysis that you want to stay ahead of, hit subscribe. We cover the stories that matter before they become the headlines that everyone else is scrambling to catch up on.